Although the notion of Harry Potter spending his entire young life being neglected and abused by the Dursleys is a confusing and unappealing element of his characterization, it is an unfortunately common trope within the world of children's stories. It's an incredibly unrealistic narrative, as the vast majority of people who endure mistreatment in their early years have understandable and entirely predictable negative outcomes as a result of it. And in order for survivors to become well-adjusted and happy teenagers or adults, they need to actually go through some kind of personal development, usually with outside help. It's not impossible for a horrifically mistreated kid to be a wonderful and well-balanced person on their own. But it's not nearly as common as most fictions would want their audiences to believe. But the classic Cinderella story is a tale as old as time, and it's a popular trope within children's fiction for a reason. However, the presentation of Harry Potter as a child who is hidden away under the stairs and emerges as the nearly perfect hero that the wizarding world needs is hard to believe, but also incredibly interesting as the overall story and mythology of the wizarding world develops throughout each book. The one particular twist that adds a really intriguing potential dimension to Harry Potter as a character is the revelation that he himself is actually one of Voldemort's Horcruxes, accidentally made when the Dark Lord tried and failed to kill Harry as a baby. Horcruxes are presented as some of the darkest, most frightening magic in existence. And like most of these extremely powerful primordial forces, their effects can be seen and felt by everyone around them. The presence of Horcruxes can have enormous effects on even the nicest of people, as the reactions of characters like Ginny or Ron demonstrate. Horcruxes seem to act as a magnifier for any negative thought or emotion from the people around it, and being in proximity to one apparently takes a seed of pain and doubt and can grow that into a potentially relationship-ending, or possibly even life-ending, amount of negativity. And unsurprisingly, this facet of the Harry Potter mythology has resulted in more than a few speculations that the Dursleys may have been badly affected by Harry being a Horcrux. After all, it's not hard to imagine what three fountains of hostility like Vernon, Petunia, and Dudley would become if all of their worst thoughts and impulses were intensified by a chunk of Voldemort's soul. But what there hasn't been a great deal of speculation about is the effect that this would have, could have, or should have on Harry himself. Because it's already hard to believe that Harry could be subjected to constant abuse, with no positive relationships or halfway decent role models, and somehow be a kind, warm, and caring boy by the time he makes it to his first year at Hogwarts. Having friendships with Hermione and Ron would clearly have a great influence on him. But the fact that he's so well adjusted from the jump is really hard to imagine. And it's exponentially harder to understand when it comes to his secret Horcrux status. However, it's also exponentially more narratively interesting. First off, the very existence of Harry's relationships with many people, whether it's Ron or Hermione, Hagrid or McGonagall, or Luna and Neville, seems to deflate the whole theory that Harry's Horcrux made the Dursleys into even more terrible people. As his life at Hogwarts demonstrates, Harry can develop friendships and loving connections with many people who apparently experience zero negative side effects as a result of a Horcrux in their presence. Which again, presents a really fascinating paradox, as it would seem that Harry's Horcrux functions in a foundationally different way from all of the other Horcruxes. And the obvious question regarding that is, why? It's somewhat plausible that the fact that this Horcrux was created accidentally had some kind of dampening effect on the negativity of Voldemort's rogue soul fragment. But that seems improbable. If Horcruxes are supposed to be the most horrific dark magic in the world, and they can only be created through murder, then they'd likely have an effect on the immediate environment around them, even if they were a mistake. And interestingly, Harry's Horcrux does have an observable effect on him from the very start. His ability to speak Parseltongue is a direct result of the Horcrux, and he has a literal psychic connection with Voldemort as a result of it as well. Which is certainly intriguing in its own right, but it also makes it more confusing and difficult to believe that this Horcrux wouldn't have the traditional evil effect on Harry and the people around him. So ultimately, this is a question that doesn't have a canonical answer. But one intriguing possibility is that rather than making Harry an angrier, more violent, or more aggressive person, becoming a Horcrux actually made him a better one. And even further than that, it could have made him a wizard that was powerful enough to defeat Voldemort, and not just because Voldemort magically marked him as the lone rival that could beat him. Although it's a moderately small hint in the grand scheme of things. In this instance, it's possible that Neville Longbottom is once again the other side of Harry Potter's coin. Because, as was briefly explained within the story itself, Neville's family actually believed that he might be a squib, until his great-uncle Algy dropped him out of a window and he bounced. This little anecdote is obviously meant to be equal parts hilarious and horrifying, but it also offers an interesting but seemingly predictable insight into the world of magic. Because many witches and wizards display their mystical abilities for more mundane reasons, but it also makes an obvious kind of sense that someone with magical powers would exhibit those abilities when they're under imminent threat. And Harry's status as a Horcrux is interesting, because it essentially means that, in theory, his body and soul should have been under attack from Voldemort's demon barnacle that has been stuck on his head since he was an infant. Of course, Harry shows no significant signs of being drained or corrupted by the Horcrux, nor do the people around him. But perhaps that, in itself, is a sign of how the Horcrux did affect him. Maybe, instead of the Horcrux only having effects on Harry that were emotionally and morally neutral, Harry had what was essentially the magical equivalent to an immune system response to Voldemort's soul that literally made him a better person in order to protect him from Voldemort's inherent evil. It's a bit of a tinfoil hat theory to be sure, but it would make sense canonically as well. For instance, Harry does show a pretty strong predisposition to defensive magic. His ability to conjure a very powerful Patronus, when taking into consideration that he has very few happy memories, was being attacked by Dementors, and apparently had a Horcrux attached to him at the time, is downright astonishing under the circumstances. However, when looked at through a lens where Harry's magic has been in a constant state of self-defense since he was a baby, it's easier to understand how he'd be capable of such incredible displays of power. This point of view becomes even more interesting when it comes to Harry's rivalry with Voldemort. Given how the narrative developed over each book, it's easy to look back at the earlier years and find it somewhat ridiculous that Harry manages to defeat the Dark Lord and the forces working on his behalf when he was still a tween. However, if the Horcrux that was attached to Harry had a demonstrable effect on him, it actually makes a lot more sense. Harry is undoubtedly an incredibly powerful wizard. However, it seems fair to say that comparatively speaking, he's still no match for Voldemort when it comes to pure magical power. So in a certain way, it shouldn't logically be possible for Harry to defeat him half a dozen times, while coming away from their conflicts relatively unscathed. However, if the piece of Voldemort's soul that attached itself to Harry has the same kind of effects that the other Horcruxes have had, then Harry's magic has been instinctively and constantly defending itself from Voldemort's magic literally for around a decade by the time the story even starts. So yes, it would be ridiculous for a tween to defeat the most powerful dark wizard of all time, but it actually makes a great deal more sense if he has essentially had 10 years worth of training defending himself against Voldemort's magic specifically by the time that they first meet. And taking that line of thought even further, it stands to reason that if the Horcrux was constantly trying to drain Harry emotionally and psychologically, maybe he actually became a kinder and more well-adjusted person as a reflexive and defensive response. Maybe it's not just a coincidence that he managed to endure years of abuse from the Dursleys, with no real positive relationships with anyone, and come out the other side as a genuinely good person. And maybe Harry's unfailingly kind disposition is yet another instinctive attempt to defend himself from the negative influence that having a Horcrux attached to him would have had. Sure, it's a bit of a stretch, and there isn't much within the text itself to actually indicate that this is what happened. However, as it stands, Harry's status as a Horcrux, and the fact that his particular soul fragment doesn't have the same effect that the other Horcruxes have, doesn't really make sense. And this is a pretty plausible explanation as to why that is. But what do you think? Is there a possibility that Harry becoming one of Voldemort's Horcruxes actually made him a more powerful wizard, as well as a better person? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.